I want to talk today a little bit about binaural settings for mixing Dolby Atmos. I've had some questions from some people on how I handle this, and I've also seen some guys in some forums who are having some technical issues on this. So I want to show you some technical setup stuff of how I do it with Pro Tools, and then I'll talk a little bit about my own strategy, and then at the end, or towards the end anyways, I'll play a little bit so that you can kind of hear what do the binaural settings do if you're brand new to this. So anyways, let's dive in. First and foremost, the binaural settings are real important for mixing in Atmos right now because they determine the headphone experience for someone who's going to consume Atmos content, or especially Atmos music content, over headphones. If someone's listening on Tidal or Amazon, these are the settings that will affect what they hear. Currently, right now it's July 2023, and these settings don't impact all of Apple if you're listening to Atmos content on Apple. I have heard that if you're not using an Apple device, like if you're not on AirPods or Beats or something that really uses their spatial audio side of things, if you want to listen to Atmos on an Apple device just using regular headphones, I have been told that this is the version of the binaural that people will hear. Haven't tested and haven't confirmed it myself. I should probably do that, but that's something you could check into yourself if you wanted. But, for the rest of the kind of Atmos world out there, because it's not all Apple, these are the settings that are important. And eventually when Spotify gets on board with Atmos, these are probably the settings that are going to be working for Spotify. So important stuff. So let's jump over to Pro Tools and let me show you some setup stuff. I've got the I/O setup window open here in Pro Tools. I'm on the bus tab for that. This is something that is really important to me to get set up properly. I don't remember where I got these specific settings from, but I know they came out of like a demo session, maybe an Atmos demo session from Dolby, or was something from Pro Tools maybe. But basically what I have set up in here is I have the bed set up, so the 712, and that's mapping to the output for the bed, which goes to the Dolby Atmos bridge. I'm using the Dolby Atmos bridge as my playback engine in here. And then I have objects set up and, most importantly, mapped for every output. So right up through 128, and then I get to do LTC on 129 because I'm using the Dolby Atmos bridge. If you are not using the Dolby Atmos bridge and you're doing it, let's say traditionally with a second machine running the renderer, you're going to lose that last object to your time code. But this is how I've got it set up. If you don't have this set up, I think you can just go down here into default and you can say use Dolby Atmos renderer stereo and then hit default. And that should set up all of these buses. You might have to map them to a renderer. One of the places where people get into trouble on is when they've got these stereo objects set up. You can't just click, like if I fold everything down, they're all mapping to the renderer, but there's nothing you can click. You have to do them one at a time. Let's not do that. Let's pick ones that I know I'm not using. So if I come down here, 127, 128, if I remove them, now they're not mapping. If I click them again, yeah, so now they're mapping again. But you want to have everything routed and mapped to the output to get it to work. And I set up all 128 objects from the start. Every session, I always have them in there ready to go. I've seen some guys where they only set up a few objects in here and then they'll have to go in and recreate them. And it's It's really cumbersome, in my opinion. Just set them all up from the beginning. It's going to make this a whole lot easier. All right, the next big thing you need is your LTC channel. I have an aux send set up here. It just routes out to that LTC for me. And then on this, I put all of the plugins that I use that kind of interface with the renderer. You can set up separate auxes for this if you want, but they all work on the same one for me. They're all routing out the same output, so they're all going to sum together anyways. So you can just stick them together. First thing I've got on there is the LTC generator that's sending time code over to the renderer, which is important. And then I have the Binaural Settings plugin. So what this plugin does is it determines the settings in the renderer, the binaural settings. You can also just get rid of this plugin. We can hop over to the renderer and we can go into, let me find it, binaural render mode. You can set all of these up in the renderer as well. I just set them up in Pro Tools. It's a whole lot easier in my opinion. And then the settings stay with my Pro Tools session because I don't always set up a master file in the renderer, especially when I'm just bouncing offline. You don't have to do that. The renderer for me is more just, it's the renderer. It's rendering my monitoring to listen to it. Most of the time I just offline bounce, but that's a whole other topic. Hopping back over to Pro Tools. So these are where you set up all of the binaural side of things. There's binaural settings for each channel. If you've gone through Dolby training or any of this, this should all be very familiar to you. One of the things that's important to me in this plugin is I want every input to have some kind of an assignment, whether it's an object, or the bed. I've got the bed channels, and then all of these down here are set to objects. I've seen some guys, they don't set these all up. And when these aren't set to anything, it affects the inputs in the renderer, which affects how some of the mapping works. And that's where I think a lot of things start to break for guys. So I set everything up for objects right from the beginning, aside from the bed. And then I have every object ready to go. Then all of the input setup in the renderer works okay, which if I pull up the renderer, we go into the input configuration. So right now, this is all being controlled by the Atmos plugin for me, which is the way I like doing it. But it can get messed up real easily. This is one of those technical sides of things in here that you wanna lose your flow while you're mixing. Is if you don't have this set up to begin with, you're gonna kill your flow. So I just do it all in the binaural plugin, and I have a preset for this to begin with. So everything is set up as an object. Now, the next part of this plugin really relates to the strategy I use for doing binaural stuff. And full confession, I stole this idea completely from Steve Genowick. The idea is basically I have groups of objects set up for the different binaural settings. So my first 36 of them, those are kind of more utility like objects. You can see there's some stuff in here. I still have an object bed set up in there if I ever want to use it. But those are all set to off. 37 through 64 is going to be near. 65 through 96 is mid. And then 97 through 126, those are all set to far. I might have modified this a little bit from what Steve was doing, but the basic concept is to have these groups of objects set up and ready to go to begin with for the different positions. Where this originally came from was before we had the Dolby Atmos album assembler. If you were going to master an album that was mixed in Atmos, you had to use the same binaural settings for each object. So in other words, object 120 in song 1 had to have the same binaural settings as object 120 in song 2 and song 3 and 4 and so on. You couldn't have those change within the settings, or I mean, maybe you can automate them in here. I haven't looked at that, but it would get really clunky and you'd run into issues. So the solution that I believe Steve came up with was, I'll just set a bunch of objects that are all near and a bunch of objects that are mid and a bunch of objects that are far. And then they're just all set up and ready to go. The advantage to me with this is as I'm mixing, when I get to an object and I go, okay, I think I want this sound to be near, I can just assign it to one of those near objects. And I have a little list sitting on the meter bridge. Well, not really the meter bridge, but it's sitting on the top of my S1 that just says which objects go to which binaural settings. And I can just send it to that object and it's ready to go. For example, when I start checking the binaural mix, like here's an audience track that is routed to objects 97 and 98, which are my far objects because it's audience and I want that further away. If when I go and pull up the mix and start listening to it in binaural, if I go, oh, that's too far away, that sounds strange, I can just go up in here and route it to a different object. It doesn't change any of the automation that I have set up. It doesn't affect anything. It just basically, it's the same as me going into the plugin and changing the binaural settings. But it's a lot faster because I can do it right here. Just select the object and then it routes to that object. That's my approach basically to doing the binaural settings and how am I employing them. Now, most of the stuff I'm doing, as I've mentioned, is in my quote unquote mix bed. And the settings for that, I mean, the front of my bed is all set to off. Then the sides, and I believe the wides, let me find them here. Yep, front wides, those are all set to near. The rears, where are my rears? My rears are at mid right now. I think I might have used to have them at far. I ended up sending them to mid. The top of the bed, that's mid. Top front for me is mid. And then the rear of the top, those are set to far. All of that is set to go, but if I'm listening to something and something sounds funky, for example, sometimes I like taking percussion tracks and putting them up top and in the back. Well, sometimes in the binaural, that might get strange. So I can go in here into my mix bed, and if things are a little weird, I can take that. Where are they? Top rears. If far sounds strange, I can just move them to mid, and then everything's happy. Now, one of the things I should mention is when the binaural settings are set to off, it's basically, it's like it's stereo. You're not getting any of the Atmos in the binaural. And I go back and forth on these front ones. Do I like them as near or do I like them as off? And more often than not, I tend to prefer them off because that's where I have things like my drums, my vocals, bass guitar, things that really are going to anchor the song. I like keeping those off. It just keeps it a little more consistent with the stereo, and then with the rest of the instruments that I have spread out a little more with those more in the binaural settings, it just kind of opens the mix up and kind of widens it and makes it feel more open and just feel a little better. So let's listen to some stuff. So grab your headphones and hop over to Binaural. Let me pull up a section of the mix. And what I'm going to do to begin with, and I've got the vocals, and anything vocal is out because copyright stuff. People get weird. So I got a live mix here. This doesn't really have anything flying around or moving. It's really just going to be more of a kind of spatialized mix, and you can hopefully hear the difference with YouTube. We'll see. But hear the difference between the kind of stereo flattened down to me and the binaural. So we'll start with the binaural, and then I'll toggle it back and forth a little bit for you. So here we go. So to me, the binaural, it just feels a little more open. If you're wondering, like, what do I focus on? Like, I'll play a little bit more again, and just listen to the percussion that's going on that. And again, I'll start on the binaural, and then I'll go back to the stereo so that you can hear it. So just focus on the percussion. If you're looking for something to lock into, just do that. That's one of the instruments that you can really hear it on. Here, maybe this acoustic guitar too is another one. So I'll just solo this up. Might not be the best playing, but it was live. This was live. So I'll start in the binaural. Maybe I can, here, let's pull up the transport. Maybe this will make it easier for me. It's just going to go back. All right. So to me, that's one that you can really hear a big difference on. Maybe here, I've got a guitar here. I'm going to just solo one of the guitars. All my effects are muted. This is going to be just the guitar. And I'm going to jump through the different binaural settings so that you can kind of hear how that affects things. One of the things that I notice in this, in addition to it kind of feeling like it's a little more distant, is I'm starting to hear more sound in the opposite speaker. Right now, this guitar is hard to the left front, I believe. Yep. So it's hard left front. As I get into those different settings, I'm hearing more and more stuff in the right side. If you're mixing in stereo, maybe you might be able to get some depth from doing that kind of thing. Just saying. Anyways, I hope that gives you some idea of what the binaural settings do, gives you a little bit of an idea of how they affect your mix. To me, when you start putting stuff into the binaural, it helps open up the mix and make it feel more immersive on the headphones, which to me is the whole idea of having the Atmos headphone experience. In a lot of ways, having this binaural settings plugin, this is a feature to me that I feel like DAWs in 2023, like, let me pick on all of them. Why don't we just have a fader or a plugin or something where we can go, I want that further away? I mean, yeah, there's techniques, and I've learned a lot of them on how do you make something sound like it's farther away, but why isn't it this easy? I mean, shouldn't we just have a setting somewhere where you go push it back, bring it forward? From a creative standpoint, I think that would make mixing a whole lot more fun and easier to do than figuring out how to do it with reverb and equalization and changing all these things. But that's a whole other story. In the meantime, mixing in Atmos, this is what we've got. And I hope that gives you some ideas of ways to kind of use the binaural and play around with it and what it can do for your mix. So if you got questions about Atmos or the binaural stuff, leave a comment. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon.